The morning I signed over my house, my hands didn't shake. They should have, considering I was handing over $2.5 million to a son who hadn't called me on my birthday in 3 years. But at 85, I'd learned that some decisions feel inevitable, like watching storm clouds gather. You know what's coming, but you stand there anyway, waiting for the first drops to fall. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Are you certain about this, Mrs. Gordon? The notary's voice cut through the silence of my lawyer's office. Her pen hovered over the documents, and I could see the concern creased into her forehead. She was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes that reminded me of my daughter, Sheila, before Sheila learned that disappointment was a family inheritance. Quite certain. I pressed my signature across the bottom of the deed transfer, each letter deliberate and final. The house on Maple Street, the one where I'd raised 3 children, weathered Jimmy's cancer, and spent 47 years building a life, now belonged to my son, Craig. Herman Steinberg, my attorney for the past 2 decades, cleared his throat. Rose, you understand this is irrevocable. Once this is filed, I understand perfectly. I set down the pen and looked him in the eye. Herman had been Jimmy's friend before he became our lawyer, and I could see Jimmy's ghost in his worried expression. Craig promised to take care of me. It's what families do. What I didn't say was that Craig's promise had come with conditions I was only beginning to understand. 3 months earlier, when I'd first mentioned selling the house to move somewhere smaller, Craig had appeared at my door with his wife Doris in tow, their faces wearing matching expressions of calculated concern. "Mom, you can't live alone anymore," Craig had said, settling into Jimmy's old recliner like he belonged there. At 55, he developed his father's authoritative tone, but none of his warmth. "Last week, you left the stove on. Mrs. Henderson called me worried sick." I'd left the pot of soup simmering while I walked to the mailbox. Hardly a sign of dementia, but Doris had nodded gravely from the couch, her manicured fingers smoothing her designer dress. "We've been discussing this, Rose. You need supervised care." I need nothing of the sort. But even as I said it, I felt the weight of my 85 years pressing against my shoulders. The house had grown larger around me since Jimmy's death 5 years ago, its rooms echoing with memories instead of voices. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was time. "Look," Craig had continued, leaning forward with what he probably thought was sincerity. "Doris and I had been looking at assisted living facilities. There's a lovely place in Westchester." "I won't be warehoused." The words came out sharper than I intended, but Doris's quick wince told me I'd hit the mark I was aiming for. "It's not warehousing, Mom. It's practical. You sell the house, give us the money to invest properly, and we'll make sure you're taken care of. You won't have to worry about anything." That should have been my first warning. When someone tells you not to worry about anything, it usually means they're planning to take everything. But grief makes you stupid, and loneliness makes you desperate. After Jimmy died, I'd spent 5 years rattling around in a house built for a family, eating dinner alone while watching the evening news, going to bed at 8 because there was nothing else to do. When Craig offered to let me live with them, to be part of a family again, I wanted to believe in his intentions more than I wanted to examine them. Now, walking out of Herman's office with the deed transfer complete, I felt something between relief and dread. The October air bit at my cheeks as I made my way to my car, Jimmy's old Buick, reliable as sunrise and twice as predictable. In 2 weeks, I'd be moving into the guest room of Craig and Doris's Colonial in Scarsdale, and this car would be the only thing I owned that couldn't be managed, invested, or supervised. The drive home took me past the elementary school where I'd taught 2nd grade for 30 years. The playground was empty now, swings moving slightly in the autumn breeze like gentle ghosts. I'd loved those children, loved their gap-toothed smiles and their absolute certainty that I could fix anything with a Band-Aid and a kind word.
Now I wondered if Craig saw me the way those children once had, as someone who needed taken care of, someone whose choices couldn't be trusted. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment, looking at the house that was no longer mine. The maple tree Jimmy had planted when Sheila was born blazed red and gold against the afternoon sky. Its leaves would fall soon, covering the yard in a carpet of color that someone else would rake. Inside, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table where I'd helped with homework, planned birthday parties, and held Jimmy's hand during his last weeks. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. Everything looked the same, but the air felt different, thinner somehow, as if the house itself knew it had been abandoned. The phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. "Mom," Sheila's voice crackled through the connection from Portland. My youngest child, the one who'd inherited Jimmy's gentle heart and my stubborn streak. "I just got off the phone with Craig. Did you really sell the house?" I did. I sipped my tea, tasting the familiar comfort of Earl Grey and regret. "Mom, why didn't you talk to me first? Or Dick?" Dick was my middle child, a doctor in San Diego who called every Sunday, but never visited. We could have figured something out. Craig made a generous offer. The lie tasted bitter. Craig hadn't offered anything. He'd simply presented his plan as the only reasonable option, the way he'd learned to do in his career as a corporate lawyer. He and Doris want me to live with them. Sheila was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was tight with something that might have been tears. "Mom, I wanted you to come here. You know that, right? Portland's beautiful and I have that extra room." "You have your own life, sweetheart. Your job, your friends. You don't need an old woman cluttering up your space." "You're not clutter. You're my mother." The simple words hit me like a physical blow. When was the last time Craig had spoken to me with such uncomplicated love? When had he last called me simply to hear my voice without an agenda hidden behind his concern? But it was too late now. The papers were signed, the deed transferred. In 2 weeks, I'd be living under Craig's roof, dependent on his generosity and Doris's tolerance. The thought should have brought comfort. No more worrying about house repairs or lawn maintenance, no more rattling around in empty rooms. Instead, it felt like stepping into a cage painted to look like care. After I hung up with Sheila, I wandered through the house, touching familiar objects like talismans. Jimmy's books still lined the study shelves. My collection of blue willow china still filled the dining room cabinet. Craig had assured me I could bring my important things, but everything seemed important when you were looking at it for the last time. As evening fell, I found myself in Jimmy's study, surrounded by the photographs that told the story of our life together. There we were at our wedding, young and confident. There were the children at various ages, Craig, serious even as a toddler, Dick grinning with missing front teeth, Sheila fierce and determined at 5 years old. The photos chronicled birthday parties and Christmas mornings, family vacations and graduations. We'd been happy once. We'd been a family. I picked up a photo of Craig's law school graduation. He stood between Jimmy and me, his arm around my shoulders, his smile genuine and warm. When had that warmth turned to calculation? When had love become transaction? The phone rang again and I almost didn't answer, but habit won over caution. "Rose," it was Doris, her voice artificially bright. "I wanted to discuss the arrangements for when you move in. There are some ground rules we should establish." I closed my eyes and listened to her list of expectations. No smoking. I hadn't smoked in 20 years. No alcohol after 6 p.m. I had a glass of wine with dinner maybe twice a month. No visitors without advance notice, as if I had hordes of friends beating down the door. No cooking in their kitchen without permission, because apparently my 50 years of meal preparation was practice for this moment of supervised domesticity. Of course, I said to each rule, my voice steady even as something cold settled in my chest. Whatever makes you comfortable. Oh, and Rose, about your car. Craig thinks it might be better if you didn't drive, for safety reasons, you understand. We can take you wherever you need to go. I understood perfectly. They were buying a house and inheriting a problem.
Problems needed to be managed, controlled, contained. After I hung up, I sat in Jimmy's chair and felt the weight of my decisions settling around me like a shroud. Outside, the maple tree's leaves rustled in the evening wind, whispering secrets I could no longer understand. In 2 weeks, I'd be living in someone else's house, following someone else's rules, grateful for someone else's charity. But tonight, I was still Rose Gordon, owner of nothing and possessor of everything that mattered. Tonight, I could still choose what happened next. I just had to figure out what that choice would be. The guest room at Craig and Doris's house measured exactly 10 feet by 12 feet. I knew because I'd paced off during my first sleepless night, counting steps like a prisoner measuring her cell. The walls were painted a soothing beige that reminded me of oatmeal, and the single window faced north, offering a view of the neighbors' garbage cans and nothing more. "We thought you'd be comfortable here," Doris had said 3 weeks ago, gesturing around the space with the enthusiasm of a realtor showing a studio apartment. "It has its own bathroom, and you're right next to the kitchen." What she meant was that I was conveniently located for surveillance. From my room, I could hear every conversation in the kitchen, every phone call in the hallway, every argument conducted in the stage whispers that married couples perfect over decades of contained resentment. It had taken exactly 5 days for the honeymoon period to end. The first crack appeared when I offered to cook dinner. I'd spent 50 years perfecting my pot roast recipe, the one that had made Jimmy propose after our 3rd date. But when I reached for the roasting pan, Doris materialized beside me like a well-dressed specter. "Oh, Rose, you don't need to worry about cooking. I have everything planned." Her smile was sharp as a blade. "Besides, we're eating lighter these days. Craig's cholesterol, you know." I didn't know. Craig had always been healthy as a horse, inherited Jimmy's sturdy constitution along with his stubborn streak. But I nodded and retreated to my room, listening as Doris heated up something from Whole Foods that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget used to. The second crack came when Mrs. Graham from next door called to check on me. I'd taught her grandson, Timothy, for 2 years, watched him struggle with reading, until suddenly it clicked. She'd sent me Christmas cards for 15 years after he graduated. "Rose?" Her voice was warm with genuine affection. "Timothy is getting married next month. We'd love to see you at the ceremony." I was just accepting the invitation when Doris appeared, holding out her hand for the phone. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Graham, but Rose's social calendar is quite full these days. Perhaps another time." After she hung up, Doris turned to me with that same realtor smile. "You understand, don't you? We need to be selective about your activities. At your age, too much excitement isn't healthy." I understood. I understood that I was being managed like an investment portfolio, contained, controlled, and monitored for any signs of unexpected volatility. By the end of the first month, the rules had multiplied like weeds. No phone calls after 8 p.m., no visitors without 48 hours' notice, no leaving the house without Doris or Craig as an escort. The final rule came after I walked to the corner store for milk, a journey of exactly 4 blocks that I'd been making independently since I was 7 years old. "Mom, what if you'd fallen?" Craig demanded when I returned, clutching my carton of milk like evidence of my criminal intent. "What if you'd gotten confused and wandered off?" "I bought milk, Craig. I didn't attempt to climb Everest." But he wasn't listening. He was already on the phone with someone about security systems and monitoring devices. By the next morning, I needed permission to open the front door. The loneliness was a living thing, growing larger each day until it filled the beige room and pressed against my chest when I tried to sleep. I missed my garden, where I'd grown tomatoes and roses for 40 years. I missed my kitchen, where I knew the temperament of every burner and the exact spot where the morning light hit the counter. I missed the neighborhood cat who used to visit my back step, demanding tuna and offering nothing but indifferent companionship in return. Most of all, I missed being Rose Gordon instead of Craig's mother, a role that seemed to require nothing more than gratitude and increasing invisibility. The breaking point came on Thanksgiving. Sheila flew in from Portland, and Dick drove up from the city with his wife Jennifer and their twin girls. For a few hours, Craig and Doris's house filled with the sounds I remembered from holidays past: children laughing, adults arguing good-naturedly about football, the comfortable chaos of family gathering around a table. I'd offered to make my famous stuffing, the recipe my own mother had taught me during the Depression. But Doris had everything under control, which meant everything came from expensive catering companies and tasted like cardboard dressed up in good intentions. "This stuffing is different," Sheila said carefully, taking a small bite. "It's organic," Doris announced proudly. "No processed ingredients, much healthier for everyone, especially Rose." Dick's wife Jennifer nodded approvingly. "It's so important to eat clean as we age. My mother switched to organic everything after her doctor suggested it. I wanted to point out that but I'd learned that defending myself only led to concerned conversations about adjustment difficulties and cognitive changes. The real blow came when 7-year-old Eva, Dick's daughter, asked me to tell her a story. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, and she'd curled up beside me, the way children do when they sense an ally. "Tell me about when Daddy was little," she said, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. I was just launching into the story of Dick's great ant farm disaster, when Doris appeared with that same smile again. "Eva, sweetheart, why don't you go play with your iPad? Grandma Rose needs to rest." "But I want to hear the story," Eva protested, with the righteous indignation of the very young. "Another time, perhaps." Doris's voice carried a finality that even a 7-year-old couldn't argue with. As Eva trudged away, disappointed and confused, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, just crack, like ice under pressure. I was being erased from my own family, transformed from grandmother to burden, from participant to problem. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared and the family had scattered to various entertainment devices, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Sheila. She was wrapping leftover turkey with the same careful attention she'd once applied to her school projects. "How are you doing, Mom? Really?" The question was gentle, but it opened something in me that I'd been holding shut for weeks. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just adjusting." She studied my face in the dim kitchen light. At 42, she had Jimmy's ability to see through polite lies. "You don't look fine. You look old." I tried to make it a joke, but it came out flat, sad. "You look sad." She sat down the turkey and faced me fully. "Mom, if you're not happy here—" "Rose?" Craig's voice cut through the air like a knife. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Is everything all right?" "We were just talking," Sheila said, but I could hear the defensive edge in her voice. "Of course." Craig's smile was as artificial as Doris's. "Mom, you should get some rest. You've had a long day." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a dismissal, delivered with the same tone he probably used with difficult clients. Sheila caught it too. I saw her face tighten with something that might have been anger, but I was too tired to fight, too worn down by weeks of being managed and monitored. I kissed Sheila's cheek and retreated to my beige room, where I sat on the edge of my narrow bed and stared at my reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, thin-lipped, hollow-eyed, diminished. Somewhere in the past month, Rose Gordon had been replaced by this pale shadow, this grateful ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. I thought about Jimmy, about the way he used to say my name like it meant something. I thought about my classroom where I had been Mrs. Gordon to hundreds of children who trusted me to teach them not just reading and arithmetic, but how to stand up for themselves, how to be brave. When had I stopped being brave? The question followed me into restless sleep and was waiting when I woke before dawn. Outside my north-facing window, snow had begun to fall, the first storm of winter, coating the garbage cans and everything else in pristine white. I dressed quietly
and made my way to the kitchen, thinking I might at least make my own coffee without supervision. But Craig was already there, dressed for his morning run, his face tight with something that might have been annoyance. "You're up early," he said without looking at me. "I've always been an early riser. You know that." "Doris thinks you might benefit from sleeping later. Better for your circadian rhythms at your age." I stared at him. This man I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood fevers, cheered at soccer games and graduation ceremonies. When had he learned to speak to me like I was a client instead of his mother? "Craig," I said, "I need to ask you something." He glanced at his watch, already calculating the delay to his schedule. "What is it, Mom?" "Are you happy having me here?" The question seemed to surprise him. For a moment his corporate mask slipped, and I saw something that might have been guilt flicker across his features. "Of course I'm happy. We're taking care of you. That's what matters." But he couldn't quite meet my eyes when he said it, and I realized with a clarity that felt like cold water that I had my answer. I wasn't family here. I was an obligation, a duty to be discharged with minimum inconvenience and maximum tax advantage. The snow continued to fall as Craig left for his run, and I stood alone in his expensive kitchen, surrounded by appliances I wasn't allowed to use, in a house that would never be home. For the first time since signing those papers, I wondered if Herman Steinberg had been right to worry. But it was too late for regrets now. I'd made my choice, and I would have to live with the consequences. Unless, perhaps, I chose to do something different. The thought was barely formed when I heard Doris's alarm clock buzzing upstairs, signaling the start of another day of cheerful surveillance. I had perhaps 10 minutes before she appeared, before the careful management of Rose Gordon resumed. I looked out at the snow falling steadily now, covering everything in a blanket of possibility, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. The snow that had looked so promising that morning turned into a blizzard by evening. I watched from my beige prison as the wind whipped white curtains across the landscape, transforming Craig's manicured suburb into something wild and unpredictable. The weather matched my mood perfectly. Doris had spent the day in a state of controlled panic, calling Craig at work every hour to discuss contingency plans, as if the storm were a personal attack on her perfectly ordered existence. By dinner time, she was practically vibrating with anxiety. "The power could go out," she announced, setting down a plate of reheated lasagna that tasted like cardboard and disappointment. "The generator is scheduled for maintenance next week. If we lose electricity—" She trailed off, but I could see her mental calculations. An 85-year-old woman in a house without heat, the liability issues, the potential inconvenience. I was no longer just a burden. I was a potential lawsuit. "Perhaps Rose should stay at Sunny Meadows tonight," she suggested to Craig, who was scrolling through weather reports on his phone.
just as a precaution. Sunny Meadows was the assisted living facility they'd toured for future reference. I'd seen the brochures Doris left strategically around the house, glossy photos of smiling elderly people engaged in supervised craft activities and chaperoned nature walks. The monthly fee was more than most people's mortgages, which was probably the point. Nothing said quality care like a 5-figure price tag. "The roads are too dangerous now," Craig replied, without looking up. "We'll manage for one night." I heard the reluctance in his voice, the calculation of inconvenience versus liability. For the first time, I understood that my presence in their house wasn't just unwelcome. It was actively resented. I was the fly in their perfect ointment, the crack in their flawless facade. Around 10 p.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. I heard Doris's sharp intake of breath from the living room, followed by Craig's measured cursing as he fumbled for flashlights. Emergency lighting flickered on in the hallway, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts. "The temperature will drop quickly," Doris's voice carried through the darkness, tight with barely controlled panic. "Rose, you should put on extra layers and maybe move to the living room. It'll be warmer near the fireplace." I remained in my room, sitting on the narrow bed in the dark. Through my north-facing window, I could see nothing but white chaos, snow swirling in patterns that defied prediction. The cold was already seeping through the walls. But I found I didn't mind it. Cold was honest. Cold didn't pretend to care about your well-being while calculating your worth. An hour later, Craig appeared in my doorway with a flashlight. "Mom, you need to come to the living room. It's not safe for you to be alone in here without heat." "I'm fine where I am." He stepped into my room, and in the harsh LED light, his face looked older than his 55 years. Harder, too. "This is non-negotiable. You could develop hypothermia if something happened to you." He didn't finish the sentence, but I heard the subtext clearly. If something happened to me, he'd be responsible, liable, inconvenienced by investigations and explanations and the messy business of elderly death. "Of course," I said, rising from the bed. "Whatever makes you comfortable." We gathered in the living room like survivors of a shipwreck. Craig had managed to get a fire started, and Doris had arranged blankets and pillows on the couch with military precision. She'd also laid out bottles of water, granola bars, and what appeared to be her emergency medical kit, as if we were preparing for a siege rather than riding out a winter storm. "This is cozy," I said, settling into Jimmy's old recliner, the one piece of furniture I'd been allowed to bring from my real home. Doris shot me a sharp look as if she suspected sarcasm, which she should have because I was laying it on thick as honey. The hours crawled by. Craig dozed fitfully on one end of the couch while Doris maintained her vigilant watch, checking her dead phone every few minutes as if willing the power to return. I sat in Jimmy's chair and watched the fire, thinking about the storms we'd weathered together in our old house, the blizzard of '78 when we'd lost power for 3 days and made it an adventure, playing board games by candlelight and cooking soup over the fire. Jimmy had told stories during that storm, spinning tales about brave knights and clever princesses that had kept the children entertained for hours. I'd made hot cocoa on the hearth, and we'd all slept in the living room, a tangle of family warmth against the cold. This felt different. This felt like endurance rather than adventure, survival rather than togetherness. Around 3:00 a.m., Doris finally succumbed to exhaustion. Her breathing deepened into sleep, and for the first time in hours, the room felt truly quiet, except for the winds howling and the fire's gentle crackling. That's when Craig spoke, his voice low and careful in the darkness. "Mom, we need to talk." I'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. About what? About your future. About what's best for everyone. Everyone. Not me. Everyone. The distinction was telling. Doris and I have been discussing your situation, he continued, not meeting my eyes, even in the dim firelight. This arrangement isn't working out the way we hoped. I see. I kept my voice level, though something cold was crystallizing in my chest. And what would work better? Sunny Meadows has an opening. It's a lovely place. You'd have your own apartment, activities, people your own age to socialize with, professional care when you need it. Professional care? I can't afford. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. We've worked out the financial arrangements. The house sale gives us enough to cover the costs with careful management. There it was, the real reason for the transfer laid bare in the flickering firelight. My house hadn't been a gift. It had been converted into a payment plan for my own warehousing. They'd taken my independence and my assets, and now they were using both to rid themselves of the inconvenience of my presence. What if I don't want to go? The question seemed to surprise him. In the corporate world where Craig lived, problems were solved through money and management. People didn't simply refuse reasonable solutions. Mom, be practical. You can't live independently anymore. Tonight proves that. What if you'd been alone in your old house during this storm? What if you'd fallen or gotten confused? Or what if I'd had managed perfectly well the way I did for 5 years after your father died? That's different. You're older now.
Accusation. I looked at this man I'd raised, this stranger wearing my son's face, and felt something shift inside me. Not breaking this time, but hardening, crystallizing into something that might have been resolve. "Craig," I said quietly, "do you love me?" The question clearly rattled him. "Of course I love you. You're my mother." "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I love who you used to be, but this isn't sustainable, Mom. Doris is stressed. I'm worried all the time, and you're not happy either. This arrangement isn't fair to anyone." There was honesty in his words, but it was the honesty of the executioner explaining why the condemned must die. Reasonable, logical, and utterly without mercy. "You're right," I said, and saw relief flicker across his features. "This arrangement isn't fair." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars escaping into the night. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. But inside, something had settled into perfect clarity. I rose from Jimmy's chair, my movements deliberate and calm. "I'll need to make some phone calls in the morning." "Of course, Doris has all the Sunny Meadows paperwork ready." "Not to Sunny Meadows, Craig, to my lawyer." The relief vanished from his face, replaced by something that might have been alarm. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about choices, sweetheart. The ones I gave up and the ones I'm taking back." I walked to my beige room without another word, leaving Craig staring into the dying fire. Behind me, I heard Doris stirring on the couch, murmuring sleepy questions that Craig answered in urgent whispers. In my room, I sat on the narrow bed and looked out at the storm. The snow was still falling, but not as fiercely now. By morning, the roads would be clear, the power would be restored, and the normal order of things would resume. But I wouldn't be part of that order anymore. I'd spent 2 months being managed and monitored, reduced to a problem to be solved and a burden to be borne. I'd been grateful for scraps from a table I'd once set myself, apologetic for taking up space in a world I'd helped create. No more. The old Rose, the one who'd taught school for 30 years, raised 3 children, and buried a husband with dignity, was still inside me somewhere. She'd been buried under layers of loneliness and manipulation, but she wasn't dead, just dormant, like seeds waiting for spring. Tomorrow, I would start digging her up. The thought should have frightened me. Instead, it filled me with something I hadn't felt in months: anticipation. Craig had given me a gift tonight, though he didn't know it. He'd shown me exactly where I stood in his life, and more importantly, where I refused to stand any longer. Outside my window, the storm began to exhaust itself, the winds howling, fading to whispers. By dawn, the world would be transformed, covered in snow that would melt and reveal what lay beneath. I intended to do the same. The power returned at dawn with a mechanical hum that felt like resurrection. I was already awake, sitting fully dressed in Jimmy's chair, watching the weak December sun paint the snow-covered world in shades of silver and gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape so pristine it looked untouched by human hands. Craig and Doris were still asleep on the couch, twisted together in an uncomfortable embrace that spoke more of shared survival than affection. In the morning light, they looked older, diminished somehow. The perfect suburban couple reduced to refugees in their own home. I moved quietly to the kitchen and made coffee in Doris's pristine coffee maker, the one I'd never been allowed to use. The beans were expensive, imported from some boutique roastery, but the coffee tasted like every other cup: bitter, necessary, and temporary. At 8 a.m., sharp, I called Herman Steinberg. "Rose?" His voice was thick with sleep and surprise. "Is everything all right?" The storm is over, Herman. I need you to come here this morning." "Rose, what's this about?" I looked toward the living room, where Doris was beginning to stir. Soon she'd wake up fully, and the cheerful surveillance would resume. But not for long. "It's about choices, sweetheart, and consequences." By the time Craig and Doris had fully awakened and begun their morning routine of concerned glances and whispered conferences, Herman was pulling into their driveway in his reliable Mercedes. I watched from the window as he gathered his briefcase and made his careful way up the icy walkway. A tall, gray-haired man who'd spent 40 years solving other people's problems with patience and precision. "Mom," Craig appeared beside me, his hair still muscled from sleep. "Who's that?" "My lawyer." I turned to face him, and something in my expression made him step back. "I told you I had calls to make." Doris emerged from the powder room, her face scrubbed clean of yesterday's anxiety and painted with fresh determination. "Rose, you can't just invite people over without discussing it first. We have rules." The doorbell rang, cutting her off mid-sentence. I walked to the door and opened it myself, ignoring Doris's sharp intake of breath behind me. "Herman, thank you for coming." "Of course." He stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat, and I saw him take in the scene: the rumpled blankets on the couch, the emergency supplies scattered around the living room, Craig and Doris hovering like anxious guards. "Perhaps we could speak privately," Herman suggested, but I shook my head. "No need. Everything I have to say can be said in front of my family." I gestured toward the living room. "Shall we?" The next 20 minutes were among the most satisfying of my 85 years. Herman opened his briefcase with theatrical precision, removing documents that Craig's trained eye immediately recognized as legal papers. "Rose called me this morning to discuss the property transfer executed 3 months ago." "What about it?" Craig's voice was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight tremor underneath. "It seems there were certain conditions attached to the transfer that weren't made clear at the time." Herman's tone was professorial, the voice of a man explaining complex concepts to slow students. "Conditions that have now been violated." Doris perched on the edge of the couch like a bird ready for flight. "What conditions? The transfer deed was clean. We checked everything." Herman smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. The transfer was indeed clean. However, it was executed under specific representations made by Craig regarding Rose's care and living arrangements. Representations that constitute a verbal contract enforceable under New York law. I watched Craig's face cycle through confusion, comprehension, and alarm. "Mom, what is this about?"
It's about promises, sweetheart. Remember? Just take care of me, I said, and you promised you would. I settled into Jimmy's chair, feeling more comfortable than I had in months. Tell them about the conditions, Herman. Herman consulted his notes with professional gravity. Rose agreed to transfer her property based on explicit promises that she would be cared for in the family home, that she would maintain her independence and dignity, and that any changes to these arrangements would be made only with her consent and in her best interest. But that's exactly what we've been doing, Doris protested, though her voice lacked conviction. I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise. Herman produced a small digital recorder from his briefcase. Rose has been documenting her experiences here for the past month. Would you like to hear some excerpts? The blood drained from Craig's face. Mom, you've been recording us? I've been protecting myself. I kept my voice steady, matter of fact. Play the Thanksgiving conversation, Herman. My own voice filled the room, tiny but clear through the recorder's small speaker. Tell me about when Daddy was little. Then Eva's eager response, followed by Doris's dismissive interruption. Eva, sweetheart, why don't you go play with your iPad? Grandma Rose needs to rest. The silence that followed was deafening. There are hours more, I said quietly. Conversations about monitoring devices, discussions of my adjustment difficulties, your charming wife explaining to Mrs. Graham that my social calendar is too full for wedding invitations. I looked directly at Doris. Although we both know my social calendar consists entirely of supervised trips to the grocery store. Doris's face turned an interesting shade of pink. Rose, you're taking things out of context. Am I? I turned to Herman. Tell them about context, Herman. Under New York elder law, the systematic isolation of an elderly person, the restriction of their social contacts, and the denial of their autonomy can constitute emotional abuse. Herman's voice carried the weight of legal precedent, particularly when these restrictions are imposed.
After a significant financial transfer, Craig found his voice. This is ridiculous. We've been trying to keep her safe. From what? From living. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't soften them. You've kept me safe from cooking my own meals, from calling my own friends, from walking 4 blocks to buy milk. You've kept me so safe that I've forgotten what it feels like to make a choice. Mom, you're being unreasonable. No, Craig, I'm being precise. I stood up, feeling Jimmy's strength in my spine. Herman, tell them about the remedy. Herman nodded. Given the breach of the verbal contract and the documentation of elder abuse, Rose has grounds to demand the immediate return of her property. All of it. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. That's impossible, Doris whispered. The money's been invested. The property's been improved. You can't just— Actually, we can. Herman's smile was sharp as winter air. The improvements you've made will be considered compensation for Rose's rent over the past 3 months. The investments can be liquidated. It will be expensive, but it's entirely legal. Craig was shaking his head like a man trying to wake from a nightmare. Mom, think about what you're doing. Where will you live? How will you manage? You said yourself that you needed care. I said I needed family. There's a difference. I looked around the living room that had been my prison for 3 months. I'll be fine, Craig. I was fine for 5 years after your father died, and I'll be fine now. But the house is gone. We can't just recreate— Actually, I said, savoring the moment, the house isn't gone. It's not even sold. The confusion on their faces was almost comical. I never said I sold the house to you, Craig. I said I transferred the deed to a trust that I control with conditions that you've now violated. I turned to Herman. Explain it to them. Rose transferred the property to the Gordon Family Trust with herself as primary beneficiary and Craig as secondary.
The trust was structured so that Craig would inherit only if Rose was properly cared for according to the specifications outlined in the trust documents. Since those conditions have been breached, Herman shrugged, the property reverts to Rose immediately. Doris's face had gone from pink to white. You're saying the house was never really ours? Oh, it could have been, if you'd honored the spirit of our agreement, instead of just the letter. I gathered my coat from the hall closet, the same coat I'd worn to sign those papers 3 months ago. But you chose to see me as a burden instead of a person, a problem to be managed instead of a mother to be loved. Mom, please, Craig's voice cracked like a teenager's. Can't we work this out? Can't we try again? For a moment I wavered. This was my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep and cheered at baseball games. The young man who'd called me from law school every Sunday, who'd brought Doris home for dinner with shy pride, who'd named me his children's guardian in his will because he trusted me to love them as my own. But that boy was gone, replaced by this calculating stranger who spoke to me like a client and measured my worth in terms of convenience and liability. No, Craig, we can't. I picked up my purse, the same purse I'd carried when I thought I was giving my son a gift. Some choices can't be undone. Some trust, once broken, can't be repaired. I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. I'll be out of your house within the hour. Herman will handle the details of transferring everything back to my name. You'll find your possessions in boxes on the porch by tomorrow evening. Mom, wait! But I was already walking out the door into the bright December morning, where the snow sparkled like diamonds and the air tasted of freedom. Behind me, I heard Doris's voice rise to a pitch that probably shattered wine glasses 3 houses away, followed by Craig's attempts at damage control. I didn't look back. Herman caught up with me at his car. Rose, are you sure about this? It's a dramatic step. Herman, I'm 85 years old. I don't have time for anything but dramatic steps. I looked back at the house where I'd spent 3 months learning the difference between care and control. Besides, I have plans to make. Plans. I smiled, feeling more like myself than I had in months. I'm going home, Herman, and then I'm going to figure out how to live again. The key still fit perfectly in the lock of my front door, as if it had been waiting patiently for my return. I stood on the threshold for a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of home, lemon oil and old books, the faint trace of Jimmy's cologne that somehow lingered in the walls after all these years. The house welcomed me back like an old friend. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room windows, and everything was exactly as I'd left it 3 months ago. The blue willow china still gleamed in the dining room cabinet. Jimmy's books still lined the study shelves. My garden, visible through the kitchen window, slept peacefully under its blanket of snow. I was home. The first few days passed in a blur of practical necessities. Herman had been ruthlessly efficient in executing the trust's reversion clause. By Wednesday, Craig and Doris's belongings were stacked in boxes on what had been their front porch, looking forlorn and slightly desperate in the winter air. By Friday, the bank accounts had been transferred back to my name, along with all the investments they'd made with my money. I'd gained $12,000 in the transaction, the profit from their careful management of my assets. It seemed a small price to pay for 3 months of freedom. The hardest part was the silence. My phone, which had been monitored and restricted for months, now sat quiet on the kitchen counter. Sheila called twice, sounding worried and confused. Dick called once, his voice stiff with what might have been disapproval. Neither of them had heard Craig's version of events yet, but I could imagine how he'd frame it. Poor judgment, cognitive decline, an elderly woman making rash decisions she'd later regret. Let them think what they wanted. I'd spent too many years caring about other people's opinions of my choices. The knock on my door came exactly 1 week after I'd walked out of Craig's house.
I wasn't surprised to see Sheila standing on my porch, her face tight with concern and something that might have been anger. "Mom," she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the house she hadn't seen in over a year. "We need to talk." "Of course we do." I led her to the kitchen and put the kettle on, falling back into the rhythm of hospitality that had been my second language for 60 years. "Tea?" "Mom, what the hell happened?" Sheila's diplomatic nature had clearly reached its limits. "Craig called me in tears. He says you had him evicted, that you took everything back, that you accused him of elder abuse." I measured tea leaves into Jimmy's old teapot, taking my time. "Craig told you the truth for once. I'm impressed." "This is not a joke." Sheila's voice cracked with frustration. "He's my brother. You're my mother. This family is falling apart, and I don't understand why." The kettle whistled, and I poured the boiling water over the tea leaves, watching them unfurl like secrets in the clear water. "Sheila, sweetheart, sit down. Let me tell you a story." For the next hour, I told her everything. Not just the facts. Herman had already laid those out with legal precision. But the feelings, the slow erosion of dignity, the creeping isolation, the moment I realized I'd become a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Sheila listened without interrupting, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked like grief. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring into her untouched cup of tea. "I wanted you to come to Portland, remember? But you said I had my own life, that you didn't want to be a burden." "You do have your own life, and I wasn't ready to leave everything I'd built here. But you were ready to live with Craig." The accusation hung in the air between us. I could have explained about loneliness, about the way grief makes you vulnerable to promises that sound like love. Instead, I told her the truth. I thought he needed me. I thought taking care of me would give him purpose, make him feel useful. I was wrong. I sipped my tea, tasting regret and clarity in equal measure. Craig never wanted a mother. He wanted an asset to manage and a problem to solve. Sheila's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have visited more. I should have seen." Should have, could have, would have. I reached across the table and took her hand. "The past is done, sweetheart. The question is, what happens next?" What happened next surprised everyone, including me.
2 days after Sheila flew back to Portland, reassured but still worried, another knock came at my door. This time it was Eva, Dick's 7-year-old daughter, standing on my porch with her twin sister, Grace, both of them looking like refugees from a Norman Rockwell painting in their matching red coats and knit hats. "Grandma Rose!" Eva launched herself into my arms with the fearless affection of childhood. "Daddy brought us to see you." Dick stood at the end of my walkway, his face carefully neutral. At 48, he had inherited Jimmy's cautious nature and my stubborn streak, which made him both the most reliable and the most judgmental of my children. Behind him, his wife Jennifer waited in their car, her expression unreadable through the tinted windows. "Hello, Mom." Dick's voice was formal, the tone he probably used with difficult patience. "The girls wanted to see you." "Just the girls?" I kept my voice light, but Dick had the grace to look uncomfortable. "We heard about the situation with Craig." The situation, as if my reclaiming of dignity and autonomy was a natural disaster that had befallen the family, rather than a choice I'd made with full knowledge and clear intent. "Would you like to come in?" I asked. "I was just making hot chocolate." The girls answered for him, practically dragging their father up the front steps and into the warmth of my kitchen. Within minutes, they were settled at my kitchen table with steaming mugs of cocoa topped with marshmallows, chattering about school and friends and the new hamster they'd gotten for Christmas.
Dick stood awkwardly by the counter, declining my offer of coffee, his eyes cataloging every detail of the house as if looking for signs of the mental deterioration Craig had probably diagnosed. Sitting here alone again. I am. At 85, last time I checked? Yes. He was quiet for a moment, watching his daughters argue amicably over the last marshmallow. Craig says you recorded private conversations, that you used them to blackmail him. Craig says a lot of things. Most of them are self-serving. I poured myself coffee from the pot I'd made earlier, savoring the simple pleasure of using my own kitchen at my own pace. Dick, do you think I'm incompetent? The blunt question seemed to surprise him. No, of course not. Do you think I'm vindictive? No. Do you think I would destroy my relationship with my son without cause? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. No, but Mom, what you did, it's so extreme. There has to be another way to work things out. There was another way. I tried it for 3 months. It involved smiling while I was diminished, saying thank you while I was dismissed, and being grateful for the privilege of disappearing from my own life. I sat down my coffee cup with more force than necessary. I'm too old for that kind of patience, Dick. Eva looked up from her cocoa, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. Grandma Rose, are you sad? The question, delivered with a child's unerring ability to cut straight to the heart of things, made my chest tight. Sometimes, sweetheart, but not today. Good, Eva said solemnly, because Uncle Craig was crying at Christmas and Daddy was angry and Mommy kept whispering about lawyers. I don't like it when grown-ups are upset. Out of the mouths of babes. I looked at Dick, who was staring at his daughter with something that might have been shame. Eva's right, he said quietly. This is affecting everyone. The girls keep asking why Uncle Craig moved into a hotel, why Aunt Doris won't talk to anyone, why you aren't coming to family dinners anymore. And what do you tell them? That grown-ups sometimes disagree about important things? That's true, we do. I sat down at the table between the twins, feeling the simple pleasure of being surrounded by unconditional love. Eva, Grace, would you like to help me make cookies? The next hour was pure joy. We made Jimmy's mother's oatmeal raisin cookies from memory, the girls taking turns measuring ingredients and stirring batter while Dick hovered nearby, gradually relaxing as he watched his daughters bloom under my attention. These were the moments Craig and Doris had stolen from me. Not just my autonomy or my dignity, but my purpose, the chance to be useful, to be needed, to share the accumulated wisdom of 85 years with people who actually wanted to receive it. As the cookies baked, filling the kitchen with the scent of cinnamon and home, Dick finally sat down at the table. Mom, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. For what? For not paying attention? For assuming Craig had everything under control? For not asking how you felt about any of it? I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. You live 3,000 miles away, sweetheart. You couldn't have known. I should have made it my business to know. The timer chimed and I rose to pull the cookies from the oven, golden brown and perfect. They looked like every batch I'd made for the past 60 years. Some things, I thought with satisfaction, don't change just because the world tries to make them. As Dick bundled the twins back into their coats an hour later, Eva tugged on my skirt. Grandma Rose, will you come to my birthday party next month? I looked at Dick, who nodded slowly. If Grandma Rose wants to come, she's welcome. I'd love to come, sweetheart. After they left, I sat in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of an afternoon well spent. Flour on the counter, cookie crumbs on the table, 3 coffee cups in the sink. The house felt alive again, filled with laughter and purpose instead of surveillance and management. The phone rang as I was washing dishes. Sheila's number appeared on the caller ID. "Mom." Her voice was tight with something that might have been excitement. "I've been thinking about what we talked about what happens next." "Oh? How would you feel about having a roommate for a while? I can work remotely, and Portland's expensive anyway. I could use a change of scenery." The offer was generous, but I could hear the worry underneath it. Sheila was still thinking like Craig, seeing me as someone who needed supervision, protection, management. "That's sweet of you, darling, but I'm not ready for company just yet." "Mom, I don't mean it wouldn't be like with Craig. I'd be your guest, not your keeper." I smiled, hearing Jimmy's stubborn optimism in our daughter's voice. "I know, sweetheart, but I need to remember how to live alone again, how to make my own choices, good and bad, how to be Rose Gordon instead of someone's burden or someone's responsibility." "But what if something happens? What if you fall or get sick or—" "Then I'll deal with it the same way I dealt with 47 years of marriage, 30 years of teaching, and 5 years of widowhood." I dried the last coffee cup and put it away in its proper place. "Sheila, I love you, but I need you to trust me to know what I need." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was soft, with something that might have been understanding. "Okay, Mom, but I'm calling every week, and if you change your mind, you'll be the first to know." After I hung up, I walked through my house in the gathering dusk, turning on lights and drawing curtains against the winter night. In the living room, I paused at the mantelpiece, where photographs chronicled the decades of my life with Jimmy and our children. There was Craig at his law school graduation, young and proud and genuinely happy. There was the photo from his wedding, where he danced with me to The Way You Look Tonight, while Doris smiled from the sidelines. There were pictures of holidays and birthdays, family vacations, and quiet Sunday afternoons. All the evidence of a life shared and love given freely. I didn't take the photos down. Craig was still my son, even if he was no longer someone I recognized. But I didn't linger over them either. The past was past, and I had a future to build. Outside my front windows, snow began to fall again. Not the violent storm that had catalyzed my awakening, but gentle flakes that drifted down like blessings. I made myself dinner, pot roast because I could, opened a bottle of wine because it was after 6 p.m. and no one could tell me otherwise, and settled into Jimmy's chair with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, and for the first time in years, I felt the deep satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged. The phone didn't ring. No one knocked on my door. No one monitored my activities or questioned my choices. I was 85 years old, alone in a house I owned free and clear,